Most people think vampires sprang into existence, fully formed from the pages of Bram Stoker's Dracula, or from the expressionist shadows of Nosferatu, that image of the charismatic, aristocratic predator with a taste for bloodis seared into pop culture. But what if that figure is, historically speaking, a modern marketing spin on something far older and far weirder? Today, we're going to unpack the roots of the vampire myth in Eastern Europe. Specifically, we'll meet the Strigoi, not the sexy, sophisticated monster of Victorian fiction, but a chaotic, folkloric terror born of ancient fears. We're not just talking about horror stories here. These beliefs are windows into how people for centuries understood life, death, and the uncanny. And they didn't think they were just stories. Strigoi weren't aristocrats in capes, they were restless spirits, the undead. And they were terrifying. It's easy to dismiss these old beliefs as primitive superstition, but doing so sells them short. When we look at the Strigoi, we're seeing communities trying to make sense of the most frightening, inescapable reality, that people die, and sometimes death doesn't make sense. Imagine living in an isolated mountain village pre-modern Romania. Disease sweeps through, people die in agony, and you don't know why. The idea that their spirit might be angry, vengeful, or corrupted doesn't just explain things, it gives you something to do about it. You can appease them, ward them off, protect your family. That's the real root of vampire lore. It wasn't about a suave predator seducing maidens. It was about your neighbor who died badly and wouldn't stay dead. The idea of the Strigoi is older than Christianity in Romania. It comes from pre-Christian Dacian beliefs. These legends didn't pop up in a vacuum. They were the product of layered cultural traditions that go back millennia. Long before Christianity arrived in the Carpathians, the Dacians and ancient Indo-European people had animist beliefs in souls and spirits that could linger, get lost, or be corrupted. They believed the soul had multiple components, some of which might wander or become malevolent if not guided properly. When Slavic populations moved in, their own folklore about vampires and revenants merged with these older Dacian ideas. The result was a rich, evolving belief system about the undead that predated the church. Christianity didn't erase these ideas. It tried to absorb and redefine them, transforming local spirits into demons, pagan rituals into exorcisms. But on the ground, villagers kept their older practices alive, simply rebranded in Christian terms. This layered belief system is something you see all over the world. Look at Mexico's Day of the Dead, pagan ancestor worship hybridized with Catholicism, or Japan's Obon festival, where Buddhist rites blend with older Shinto traditions. So Romania's Strigoi, they're part of that universal human pattern of trying to manage the terrifying mystery of what happens after death. Romania's isolated geography helped these beliefs flourish. If you want to understand why these ideas persisted so vividly in Romania, you can't ignore the land itself. The Carpathian Mountains are rugged, remote, and until relatively modern times, they limited travel and communication. Villages were isolated 4 months in winter. Information spread slowly. Traditions held on fiercely. Anthropologists often talk about how geographical barriers create cultural continuity. In Transylvania and Wallachia, old beliefs stuck around because they weren't constantly diluted by outside influences. Of course, merchants, soldiers, and priests did travel, but they didn't uproot centuries of local custom overnight. Instead, they layered new ideas onto old ones. A vampire might become a demon in the priest's sermon, but at the graveside, the family still left offerings or performed rituals older than Christianity itself. This is something that always fascinates me about folk beliefs. They're incredibly resilient. Even when they're suppressed, they go underground, adapt, and resurface in new forms. There were 2 types of Strigoi, living and the dead. Now, let's get to the heart of the folklore. The Strigoi weren't a single category of monster. They had 2 main forms that reflect different anxieties. 1, living Strigoi. These were people born with certain traits. Maybe they had a cooler membrane over their face at birth, or were unusually gifted able to heal, curse, or foresee the future. Such people weren't always shunned, though. They might be respected, feared, even sought out. This dual role is something you see in other cultures too. Think of shamans, witches, or cunning folk in European lore. They're both helpers and threats. It's the same with living Strigoi. But if one turned malicious if crops failed, people sickened, or babies died, they might be blamed. In such cases, communities might try to expel them, forcibly cure them, or worse. This dynamic reveals a lot about human psychology. We elevate people who seem to have special knowledge or power, but we also fear them, especially when things go wrong. To dead Strigoi. These are the classic revenants, a corpse that rises from the grave to torment the living. Signs included: rosy or plump skin, interpreted as unnatural preservation, blood at the mouth, body shifting in the coffin. Remember, without modern embalming or forensic science, a decomposing body sometimes did these things naturally. Blood might leak from the nose or mouth. Gases could make a corpse appear bloated. To the villagers, these were clear signs the dead was still feeding. This wasn't just idle gossip, it led to real, serious action. Graves were opened. Corpses were staked, decapitated, burned. It's easy to see this as barbaric, but from their perspective, they were protecting the entire community. I think this is one of the most important things to understand about vampire legends. They're not just Romanian. Almost every culture has some version of the returning dead. The Norse Strigoi, which rises from the grave to guard treasure or torment the living. The Slavic Upia, which feeds on blood. The Chinese Jiangxi, a hopping corpse that drains life force. Even older Mesopotamian spirits that possess the living. It's a cross-cultural fear, and it makes sense. The dead are supposed to stay dead. When they're done metaphorically or literally, it's horrifying. It also tells us something about human social order. We need clear boundaries, life and death, purity and corruption. When those boundaries blur, society feels threatened. Living Strigoi could be identified from birth by certain signs. One of the most fascinating parts of the folklore is how it tried to predict or spot potential Strigoi before they became dangerous. For the living ones, being born with a call, speaking early, unusual healing or cursing ability, red hair or different colored eyes in some areas. For the dead, blood in the coffin, strange preservation, animals behaving oddly near graves. These are all classic scapegoat mechanisms. When tragedy struck, disease, crop failure, infant mortality, villages looked for someone or something to blame. This isn't unique to Romania. The European witch trials followed the same logic. Find the outlier, accuse them of bringing calamity, and by punishing them, restore order. But it's also a survival tactic. In a pre-scientific world, having any method to identify threats, even if wrong, gave people a sense of control. When I first learned about the Strigoi, I was struck by how much more complex they were than the Dracula of movies. The Hollywood vampire is a seducere metaphor for lust, forbidden desire, foreignness. The Strigoi is about fear of death, fear of community betrayal, fear of natural processes that people couldn't understand. It's not sexy. It's tragic and disturbing. And to me, that's what makes it compelling. Villagers took drastic measures to prevent Strigoi attacks. When people truly believe the dead can rise to torment the living, they don't just sit around and hope for the best. They develop elaborate, sometimes gruesome ways to fight back. For the Strigoi, these weren't metaphors, they were real threats that required decisive action. In many Romanian villages, people believed that certain burial practices could prevent a corpse from becoming Strigoi. Driving a nail through the forehead or heart, binding the corpse with iron, burying it face down, sprinkling poppy seeds to force the spirit to stop and count them endlessly. These measures might sound bizarre or cruel to us, but they had a clear logic. They were about control, imposing order on death itself. This is actually a near universal human impulse. Across cultures, burial practices often serve to both honor the dead and keep them from coming back. In parts of Greece, people used heavy stones on graves to keep the dead in. In parts of medieval England, they buried people at crossroads to confuse their spirits. When you study these customs side by side, It's clear that fear of the returning dead is not just a Romanian oddity. It's a shared human anxiety with countless local variations. If villagers believed someone was a Strigoi after death, they would exhume the body. One of the most shocking aspects of Strigoi belief is what people did after someone died. If misfortune struck a village, a plague, failed harvest, unexplained death, suspicion might focus on the newly dead. Entire communities would gather at night to dig up the grave. They'd look for telltale signs: fresh blood at the mouth, unusual preservation, bloating or gas. Modern science explains these phenomena. Acid decomposition produces gases. Bodily fluids shift. But to them, these were clear signs the corpse was feeding on the living. So they fought back. Rituals might include driving a stake through the heart, decapitating the corpse, burning the body, and scattering the ashes. From our perspective, this is horrific. But for them, it was an act of community protection, as essential as quarantining plague victims. In fact, these actions were often formalized. There were even semi-professional vampire hunters who specialized in these rituals. Think about that. A whole social role dedicated to dealing with the undead. It shows how seriously these fears were taken and how embedded they were in daily life. The church tried to ban these practices, calling them pagan. It's important to remember that these rituals didn't go unchallenged. The Orthodox Church condemned many anti-Strigoi practices as remnants of paganism. Exhuming bodies, mutilating corpses, or performing magic rituals were officially forbidden. Priests preached against them. But these prohibitions didn't necessarily work. Why? Because official religion rarely fully erases local tradition. Instead, people blend them. Even if you were a devout Orthodox Christian, when your family was dying mysteriously, you'd do anything to stop it, even dig up Uncle Iron's grave. It's easy to judge these communities as superstitious or irrational. But think about it. They were responding to existential threats with the tools they had. Science didn't have answers. Doctors were rare or non-existent in rural villages. The priest's prayers didn't always work, so people fell back on what their ancestors did. This is an incredibly human story. It's not just about fear of monsters, it's about the limits of institutional control over local belief. There were documented vampire panics in Romania and other parts of Eastern Europe. It wasn't just isolated incidents. At times, entire regions experienced vampire panics. These were outbreaks of fear that spread like wildfire, much like witch hunts in Western Europe. One death led to another. Rumors spread that the first deceased was visiting the living at night. More people fell sick. The community demanded action. Graves were opened, bodies desecrated, corpses burned. These episodes have been documented well into the modern period. Austrian authorities in the 18th century sent officials to investigate vampire cases in Serbia and Wallachia because the panic disrupted order and trade. One famous case involved the exhumation of a man, Pet Oblogojevic, in Serbia in 1725, and locals claimed he had killed 9 people after his death. Austrian military authorities actually wrote detailed reports describing the vampire signs on his corpse. These reports became part of what spread vampire lore to Western Europe. It's worth pausing here. The 18th century Enlightenment, era the age of Voltaire and Newton, also featured state-sponsored investigations into alleged vampires. That contradiction is fascinating. It shows that rationalism didn't uniformly conquer older fears. Instead, these beliefs persisted and adapted, even as society became more modern. I find it fascinating how these panics parallel other outbreaks of communal fear: witch hunts in Europe and North America, anti-werewolf trials in France, demonic possession scares in Puritan New England. These events share common features: sudden, unexplained deaths or illness, collective anxiety looking for a scapegoat, institutional authorities trying to contain panic while sometimes fueling it. The vampire panic wasn't just folklore. It was a social phenomenon that revealed how communities manage fear, grief, and uncertainty. We see the same patterns today with conspiracy theories or moral panics. The details change, but the psychology remains deeply familiar. Some scholars link vampire lore to disease outbreaks. A really compelling theory is that vampire myths are cultural responses to disease. Think about it. Tuberculosis, plague, cholera. These diseases cause wasting, bloody coughing, sudden mass death. People infected seem to drain the life from their loved ones, one by one. Without germ theory, it made perfect sense to see illness spreading like a curse. If your child dies of TB, then your spouse, then your neighbor, you need an explanation. The idea that the first victim is returning to kill the others gives you a narrative, a target, a way to fight back. In New England in the 19th century, there were actual vampire exhumations linked to tuberculosis outbreaks. The most famous was Mercy Brown in Rhode Island. Her family exhumed her body, burned her heart, and made a tonic for her sick brother to drink, hoping to break the curse. It's nearly identical to Romanian Strigoi rituals. This tells us something profound. People separated by oceans, cultures, and centuries came up with strikingly similar ways to cope with tragedy. Belief in the Strigoi entirely went away. Even today, stories of the Strigoi linger in Romania. While few people take them literally, you still hear warnings not to disturb certain graves. Local ghost stories often have Strigoi elements. Rural elders might quietly share just-in-case burial precautions. In the 21st century, there have even been a few sensational cases where graves were opened by villagers convinced the dead were rising. This isn't about mass belief, it's about tradition, cultural memory, and the lingering power of old fears. It's similar to how in the US, people don't really believe in witches anymore, but Halloween features witches as icons. Or in Japan, people might not literally fear Yurei, but they still honor ancestors carefully to avoid angry spirits. These old beliefs survive in ritual, story, and cautionary tradition. For me, learning about the Strigoi has always been humbling. It's easy to feel superior, to say, "Oh, those medieval peasants were so superstitious." But what would we do if our children died mysteriously, one after another, and no doctor could help? We'd look for any answer. We'd try anything. These beliefs weren't stupid. They were a kind of logic in the absence of science, a desperate attempt to find agency. And even today, despite all our technology, people still fall into scapegoating, conspiracy theories, and magical thinking when they're afraid. The Strigoi remind us that fear of death and fear of the unnatural is part of what makes us human. Vlad III Dracula wasn't seen as a vampire in his time. Let's talk about the most famous name in vampire lore, Dracula. It's ironic that when people think of vampires, they immediately picture Count Dracula, fictional creation inspired by Vlad III of Wallachia. But here's the truth, Vlad wasn't a vampire in the Strigoi sense at all. He was a 15th century warlord, famous or infamous for brutally defending his territory against the Ottoman Empire. His favorite method of punishment was impalement, hence the nickname Gepek, or the Impaler. Chroniclers, especially his enemies, described horrific scenes, entire forests of impaled corpses meant to terrify would-be invaders. But none of his contemporaries thought he drank blood, returned from the grave, or stalked peasants at night. The vampire connection is a literary invention, layered onto his name centuries later. Bram Stoker used the name because it sounded ominous. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula is the real source of the modern vampire archetype. Stoker found the name Dracula in history books describing Vlad III. He learned it meant son of the dragon or son of the devil, since Vlad's father was inducted into the Order of the Dragon. It sounded sinister and exotic effect for his villain. But Stoker didn't really know Romanian folklore. He borrowed bits and pieces from Eastern European myths about the undead and repackaged them with Victorian anxieties about sex, contagion, and foreigners. That's why Stoker's Dracula is an aristocratic, seductive, almost demonic figure. He's not a bloated, unwashed peasant corpse like the Strigoi. In other words, Vlad III inspired the name. Strigoi lore inspired certain themes. But the vampire as we know it is a Western invention, a Gothic monster tailored for British readers. Strigoi were not suave counts. The modern vampire is often a charismatic, tragic anti-hero. Dracula in Stoker's novel, and Rice's Louis and Lestat's Twilight's Edward Cullen, Count von Count on Sesame Street. But the original Strigoi was no aristocrat. It was a rotting, ravenous revenant. Imagine you're a Romanian villager in the 1700s. You don't worry about charming nobles in capes. You fear that your dead neighbor is clawing out of his grave to drink your blood and spread disease. Western literature sanitized and romanticized the vampire. It turned it from a terrifying corpse into a brooding gentleman. This shift wasn't just artistic, it reflected changing cultural fears. It's worth asking, why did the West reinvent the vampire as an alluring figure? One answer is Victorian repression. Stoker's Dracula is full of sexual undertones, biting as penetration, the fear of foreign seduction, corrupting pure English women. The vampire became a symbol of forbidden desire. In the 20th century, this eroticism only intensified. Vampires turned from predators into romantic partners. Why? Because fear and desire are closely linked. The undead lover represents taboo longing, the allure of immortality, the thrill of danger, the promise of eternal youth. It's a far cry from the Romanian Strigoi, which represented disease, decay, and social disruption. The transformation of the vampire myth says more about us than about them. Other Slavic regions had similar undead myths, while Romania's Strigoi is the focus here. It's important to realize vampire-like creatures were common throughout Eastern Europe. They appear in Russia and Ukraine, the Vrykolokas in Greece, the vampire in Serbia and Bulgaria. These beings shared core traits. They rose from the grave, fed on the living, spread sickness. The differences were in details. Methods of destruction varied: staking, decapitation, burning. Causes of vampirism differed: improper burial, suicide, witchcraft. Local customs influenced how these threats were managed. This broad similarity suggests a shared cultural need to explain and control death and disease. Western popular culture changed the vampire into something new. It's tempting to see vampires as static myths that traveled west intact. But that's not what happened. The folk vampire was a communal threat, a disease carrier, a social menace, an outsider who used to be one of us. The literary vampire evolved into something personal and psychological. The seducer, the tragic immortal, the glamorous anti-hero. This change wasn't random. It reflected Western anxieties about sex, modernity, race, and class. For example, in Stoker's Dracula, the foreign count threatens British purity. In Rice's novels, vampires are outcasts exploring identity, sexuality, and morality. In Twilight, vampirism becomes a metaphor for adolescent desire and restraint. Meanwhile, in many rural Eastern European communities, the older fear of the returning dead as a disease vector lingered far longer. Here's something rarely discussed. Western Europe loved to exoticize Eastern Europe as dark, backward, and superstitious. The vampire myth fit perfectly into that narrative. Writers, journalists, and travelers portrayed the Balkans as a place of ancient curses, primitive peasants, and violent customs. The vampire panic reports from the Habsburg authorities in the 1700s were read with both horror and fascination in Western salons. This wasn't neutral storytelling. It was a way to define the civilized West against the barbaric East. Even today, tourism in Transylvania often sells this exotic, spooky image, but the real history is more nuanced. These beliefs were rationally grim ways to explain the unexplained and protect communities. Honestly, this part hits home for me. It's easy to look at old reports of villagers digging up corpses and think, how primitive. But imagine being in their shoes. No germ theory, high infant mortality, epidemics with no known cause, limited medical help. If your loved ones were dying, you'd want an explanation and the explanation. These communities weren't stupid. They were applying the knowledge they had, passed down over generations. Meanwhile, Westerners often didn't try to understand. They recorded these rituals with disgust, seeing them as proof of Eastern Europe's otherness. I think that's a lesson in humility. We all fear death. We all invent stories to control it. But not everyone's stories get treated with respect. Vampire myths tell us about ourselves. At its core, the vampire is a mirror for human fears. Fear of death, fear of contagion, fear of outsiders, fear of our own desires. These myths adapt because those fears adapt. In Romania, the Strigoi embodied disease and social breakdown. In Victorian England, Dracula embodied sexual panic and xenophobia. In modern fiction, vampires are brooding lovers or reluctant predators, embodying our fascination with power and immortality. By studying these changes, we don't just learn about folklore, we learn about ourselves. Today, the Strigoi is part of Romanian heritage. While literal belief has faded, the Strigoi remains part of Romanian cultural heritage. You can find folkloric festivals referencing the undead, tour guides telling local legends, grandparents sharing old burial precautions as cautionary tales. It's folklore, but it's also memory. These stories aren't just spooky entertainment. They're living links to ancestors who tried to understand an often terrifying world. They also serve as warnings about what happens when fear spirals out of control, leading to real violence against the dead, and sometimes the living. What strikes me most is how universal these patterns are. Around the world, people develop similar beliefs about revenants. In Japan, the gaki-hungry ghosts tormented by insatiable cravings. In China, the Zhongsha haunting corpses that drain life energy. In the Caribbean, the Sukiyanta woman who sheds her skin to drink blood. All these myths reflect shared anxieties about death, the boundary between life and death, and the social disruption caused by unexplained illness. They also show that humans everywhere tried to manage these fears with ritual, story, and sometimes violent communal action. For me, learning about the Strigoi isn't just about horror stories. It's about empathy. We're all going to die. We're all going to lose people we love. In the face of that terror, people tell stories to make sense of it. Sometimes those stories become beautiful traditions. Sometimes they justify terrible acts. But they're always human. The vampire is not just a monster. It's a window into how we handle our deepest fears and how those fears change with time and culture. Vampire panics faded with modern science. It's worth asking, why did people stop believing in the Strigoi in the old sense? One big factor was science. As germ theory spread in the 19th century, people slowly understood that disease was not caused by undead relatives, but by bacteria and viruses. Quarantine replaced exhumation. Doctors replaced priests and witch hunters. But belief didn't disappear instantly. Even in the 20th century, in some rural areas, you could find old ritual staking corpses, placing heavy stones on graves, or burying the dead face down to confuse them. Old habits die hard, especially when fear is involved. Still, by the mid-20th century, these practices had mostly turned into folklore, a story about the past, rather than a living belief. Today, these legends are part of Romania's tourism industry. It's also striking how something once truly terrifying became a marketing tool. Today, vampire country is big business in Romania. Tour of Bran Castle marketed as Dracula's castle, even though Vlad III probably never lived there. Souvenirs with bats and blood-dripping fonts. Hotels and restaurants themed around Dracula lore. Some Romanians see this with mixed feelings. On one hand, it brings in tourists and money. On the other, it flattens a complicated history into cheap thrills. It turns a centuries-old fear of disease and death into Instagram photos of people posing with plastic fangs. There's a sense of cultural dissonance. For Romanians, Strigoi are an old folk belief rooted in real suffering. For tourists, they're campy fun. This raises an interesting question. What happens when folklore goes global? The Strigoi was once a local myth, shaped by Romanian culture and history. But Dracula turned it into a global commodity. Western horror movies, novels, and Halloween costumes remixed it into something barely recognizable to its roots. That's not necessarily bad. Stories evolve, but it's worth noticing whose version gets exported and whose gets ignored. For example, tourists flock to Bran Castle but rarely learn much about real Romanian traditions around death, burial, or ancestor veneration. In a sense, Dracula overshadowed the Strigoi. Is that theft, or just the normal flow of stories? That's a tricky question. On one hand, folklore has always traveled. Ancient trade routes spread myths alongside goods. Different cultures borrow and adapt to each other's monsters, heroes, and legends. But there's also power dynamics. Western writers and filmmakers made millions off a highly distorted version of the Eastern European beliefs, often ignoring or mocking the people who still held them. It's easy to see why some Romanians might feel protective or even resentful. At the same time, Romanian tourism agencies often lean into the Dracula branding because it sells. It's complicated. There's no single answer, but it's worth thinking about who gets to tell the story and for whose benefit. For me, this tension isn't just about vampires. It's about how cultures get flattened for mass consumption. A complicated history of disease, fear, and survival gets turned into. Come to Dracula's castle. Buy a t-shirt with fake blood. That can be fun, but it can also erase context. It's a reminder that even our entertainment carries baggage. When we engage with folklore from other cultures, we should ask, what did this story originally mean? Who told it? And why? What gets lost in translation? It doesn't mean you can't enjoy vampire movies, but maybe we owe it to the past to understand a little more about where those monsters came from. Romania doesn't have the same modern vampire as the West. Another interesting point, while Romania is often branded as the land of vampires, its modern pop culture didn't develop the same kind of sexy, tragic vampire archetype that exploded in the West. You won't find many Romanian novels about brooding immortal lovers in castles. Instead, the Strigoi remains a folk memory, something to scare kids around the fire, a relic of old rural customs, a point of cultural pride and even humor. Many Romanians roll their eyes at the Dracula hype, but also enjoy the chance to reclaim it on their own terms. Some local artists and writers have tried to present the Strigoi in all authentic ways, emphasizing its roots in rural life, disease fear, and ancestor veneration. In other words, there's an ongoing negotiation between folklore, tourism, and cultural self-understanding. The vampire has become a global figure. One undeniable fact: everyone knows what a vampire is. The Western version, immortal, seductive, tragic, has spread everywhere through movies, TV, books, and games. Dracula Stoker's novel, hundreds of film adaptations, Nosferatu, the 1922 silent film, Interview with the Vampire, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Twilight, Castlevania. Each of these reinterprets the vampire myth for its time. Fear of foreign invasion, anxiety about disease, sexual repression and liberation, the glamorization of eternal youth, but it's all built on a foundation of older, much grimmer folk fears. In that sense, even Hollywood vampires owe a debt to terrified peasants digging up corpses in the 1700s. It's also fascinating to see how different cultures have their own undead traditions. Japan, the Goki and Jikaninki spirits cursed with endless hunger. China, Jiangxi stiff, hopping corpses draining chair. Philippines, a swung shape-shifting vampiric creatures. India, Vetala spirit that possesses corpses. Africa, the Obey Ifo in West African folklore, a witch-like blood drinker. These creatures share striking similarities with the Strigoi, feeding on the living, spreading disease, returning from improper burials, blurring the boundary between life and death. It suggests that these myths respond to universal human fears. It's easy to say people just like being scared, but the vampire myth endures because it's so versatile. It can be about fear of disease, plague, HIV, COVID-19 metaphors, fear of the foreign or unknown, sexual anxiety and desire, class conflict, aristocrats feeding on peasants, immortality and its costs, isolation and loneliness. The vampire can mean different things to different cultures and generations. That's why it survives. Vampires reflect social fears. What I find compelling is how vampires adapt to fit social anxieties. Example: Stoker's Dracula in 1897 England equals fear of foreign invasion and sexual corruption. Nosferatu 1922 equals plague imagery, post-World War I trauma. 1970s 80s horror equals HIV, AIDS panic. Modern fiction equals eternal love, sexual awakening, moral dilemmas. Meanwhile, older folk traditions weren't worried about aristocratic seducers. They were worried about epidemics wiping out families. It's the same fear, expressed in different forms. Death coming for us in ways we don't understand. Ultimately, the vampire is a human fear. If you strip away the fangs and the blood, what's left? A human problem. How do we explain death? How do we keep the dead from coming back to hurt us? How do we handle guilt, grief, or the suspicion that the people we love might betray us? The vampire story has always been a way to ask these questions. Whether you're a Romanian villager staking a corpse to stop disease, or a teenager reading Twilight, you're grappling with the same basic fears. Losing control, losing loved ones, losing yourself. That's why these stories endure. For me, learning about the real Strigoi isn't about ruining the fun of vampire stories. It's about enriching them. When you realize these myths come from real people trying to survive plagues, bury their dead properly, and protect their families, the vampire stops being just a monster. It becomes a testament to human ingenuity and human fear. We can still enjoy Dracula movies, Halloween costumes, and tourist traps. But maybe we can also spare a thought for the terrified villagers who started the story. In the end, Dracula was a lie, but the vampire-ready fear that something dead will return to hurt the living that was always true. Not true in the sense of real monsters, but true to human experience. People really did watch their children die mysteriously. They really did see corpses rot in ways that frightened them. They really did try to protect themselves the best way they knew how. That's not superstition, it's survival. So next time you see a vampire in pop culture, remember, beneath the cape and the fangs lies a very old, very human fear. And that fear is still with us. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real history behind vampire myths, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more fascinating stories about folklore, history, and culture coming up, so hit that bell icon to make sure you don't miss the next one. See you in the next video.